But there was no doubt that Peter was committed. It was Peter who swears to never, ever deny Jesus. It was Peter who was told to build the church. And it was Peter who, after Jesus was taken away, was asked 3 different times if he was among those who followed Jesus. And it was Peter who said, no, no, and no. Even though he had been forewarned, even though he swore he never would, even though he had given up everything and seen miracles and been transformed, instead of speaking up, instead of engaging in a much more difficult and more complicated dialogue of who Jesus was to him and why it was so important to him, instead of explaining that very complicated relationship, he simply responded, no. Threatened, maybe. Scared, likely. But unwilling. Now, in one version of the story of the Gospels, Peter asks Jesus to explain again the parable of the blind leading the blind. And Jesus is a little impatient. Jesus asks Peter, "Are you still so dull?" You can laugh, it's funny. It's just 2,000 years old, so it takes a minute. Are you still so dull, he says. After all this, Jesus asks, have you not learned yet to be open and to trust? And that even though betrayal happens and suffering happens, there's still reason to hope and to risk. Are you so dull? This is, in fact, the church, as I understand it. Peter was charged to gather up those who keep forgetting, the dull, those who fall asleep, and bind us together in the hopes that we will unite in love. That is the church, made up of the fallible, trying to remember in the heat of the moment what is most important to us, what our values are, trying to stay awake and do better than Peter when it comes to the risking being in a conversation that matters. So I fall into that dull category, I believe, too. Because it is hard to understand why we fall back into these rhythms, back into these patterns of avoiding difficult conversations or denying feelings, often the most important ones. But it's the difficult conversations that we most need to have and that we most often put off. Like when you're up for the 3rd night in a row because a neighbor's dog is barking incessantly while you're trying to write a sermon. Or you overhear your mother-in-law telling a neighbor that your children are spoiled and undisciplined while you're on your way there to spend a week with her over the holidays. Or when the project that you're working on took twice as long as you told a client that it would, and you can't afford not to bill them for the extra time, but you're dreading the conversation. Or you want to tell your father how much you love him, but fear that the intimacy might make both of you feel awkward. Or maybe you argued with your spouse this morning and it was unresolved, and you're on your way home trying to figure out where to start. Conversation that matters is rarely, if ever, about straightening out the facts. I'm going to say that again. Conversation that matters is rarely, if ever, about straightening out the facts. I remember when I used to argue like that, when it was like, no, this is what you said. But that doesn't matter. Conversation that matters is rarely, if ever, about straightening out the facts. They are about conflicting perceptions. They're about conflicting interpretations and values. They're not about what a contract states. They're about what a contract means. They're not about what is true. They're about what is important. Most of the time, we think someone else is the problem. And interestingly, I can tell you that most of the time, those other people think we're the problem. And since it's not about what is true, and it's likely true that it's both of your faults anyway, right? Since it's likely not about what is true, if we can let go of what the problem is and start to listen for what is important to the other person, the answer, the solution, may just emerge in between us. I've heard people say, as they talk about how different little tricks that you can do to be in a good conversation, pretend that you're both right in order to move forward in a conflict. But see, I don't want you to pretend anything. I don't want you to pretend a single thing. But I do suggest that you move to a learning stance of trying to hear the other person and what is important to them. There's a really great example in this book that I love called Difficult Conversations. And it's a little story about Aunt Bertha. Some of you might know an Aunt Bertha. This is about her. When we think that they are the problem, it's usually because we think they are selfish or naive or controlling or irrational, right? When they're the problem, it's because of the kind of person they are. They're nuts, they're controlling, they're naive, they're selfish. But most of the time, when that is the case, that is a giant flag to pay attention. If that's what we're thinking, it is a flag to pay attention because we have not made room or space to hear how they connect all of their dots. So, Rory's Aunt Bertha sleeps on this very saggy mattress. Rory explains, she has terrible back problems, but no matter what I say, she refuses to let me buy a new mattress. Rory says, I am certain that she could have some kind of immediate relief if she would just let me buy her a new mattress, but she is insisting on keeping it. Everyone in my family tells me that Aunt Bertha is just crazy, that you cannot reason with her for anything. Y'all have an Aunt Bertha in your family? Maybe you work with an Aunt Bertha. Anytime you have come to this kind of standstill, it is a good clue that there is something that you do not know. Let's hear from Aunt Bertha. Aunt Bertha would be the first to agree that her mattress is indeed old and sagging. The facts are not the issue. She says, it's the one that I shared with my husband for 40 years. And it makes me feel safe. There are so many other changes in my life that Aunt Bertha says it's nice to have a little haven that stays the same. And this is my haven. That is not the argument of a crazy woman. Keeping it also provides Bertha with a sense of control over her life. When she complains, she says, it's not because she wants answers or a new mattress. It's because she likes the connection that she feels when she keeps people current on her daily comings and goings, which for her consist of very few things these days. So how she slept is a large part of her answer. When we ask Aunt Bertha about how she feels about Rory, Aunt Bertha says, I love her, but Rory can be difficult. She doesn't listen or care much about what other people think, and when I tell her that, she gets angry and unpleasant. Rory thinks the problem is Aunt Bertha, and Aunt Bertha seems to think that the problem is Rory. And because we don't know either one of them, and because this isn't our family or our conflict, it's obvious that they are struggling in their conversation to hear what's important. They're struggling in their conversation not with the facts or about who is rational or irrational and who is difficult. Now, there are two key mistakes that we often make when we're in the midst of a difficult conversation. See, our assumptions, even about people who we love and we believe, are often wrong.